Hello, everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Clades once again, and I'm Albert.
And I'm Joan.
Right. Um, so yeah, it's been a while. We took a little break over the holiday season, and then we had some technical difficulties, so I had to delay it a bit further. But we are back now. So yes. Um, I guess before we begin proper, how have you been for this past break?
Oh, I've been busy, but
Yeah.
I've been good. We've been doing a lot of preparations at home because we're getting ready to move here soon. Um, Moving into an apartment complex, and it's all been a matter of just making sure we have all of our things organized, packed, and ready to go. Um, but in the meantime, I've been you know keeping up with news and uh, working on personal projects here and there, and things have been pretty good on my end. What about you, Albert?
Yeah, I've been very busy too. Yeah, lots of so busy with a lot of research, of course. So basically, I'm supposed to be finishing up my PhD later this year, so I'm kind of trying to squeeze in uh, that kind of final rush in the end. So
Right.
yeah, um, and but yeah, I've been busy with other things too. Reviewing a few papers, preparing for a few conferences that'll come later in the year. Um, and I do have a couple of things that are particularly relevant, arguably, for this podcast. So, first of all, is that late last year I got to consult on a project for the educational studio Kurzgesagt, um, which many of you might have heard of. So they're best known for making these YouTube videos. They're very distinctive art style. Yeah, very stylized but extremely aesthetically pleasing art style they have. Would you agree?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. They have the little bird characters that they put everywhere.
Right. Yeah, and so late last year, basically on their Twitter account, they tweeted out a tree of life graphic that they kind of used in one of their videos. But the thing about that graphic was that it was only meant, like in the original video, to show up for a split second. So um, that particular graphic was not intended to be especially precise or accurate in terms of the relationships they showed. But
Mhm.
since they showed it as a still on Twitter, a lot of people jumped on it and was like, wait, you're showing a bunch of these relationships between organisms that are not correct. And to their credit, they decided to say, oops, that kind of our bad. We'll make a proper one this time. Um, so they did, and they sent out a call for basically biologists who study well biologists in general, but especially biologists who study phylogenies and evolution and so on, to see can you fact check this new version of the poster for us, or a new version of the graphic for us, which they were going to make into a poster. And well, I study phylogenetics, so I decided to write to them. I didn't really expect that if they would respond, but they did, and they were like, "Yeah, can you help us with this?" And so, yeah, I became one of the consultants for this. I didn't realize while I was consulting like how many other people were also doing this, but when they released the poster, they tweeted out, they tagged all of the consultants that had helped them with this, and so yeah, I saw then that there were other people also working on it. But in any case, um, yeah, they basically gave me the opportunity to comment throughout the process of making the poster. So originally they only had a very rough kind of draft, like an outline of the groups they wanted to include and their relationships and all that. Um, Most of the relationships they show in that tree are based on a website called OneZoom, which is basically a website that tries to represent the entire kind of tree of life, um, essentially. And it's
Yeah,
most yeah, you're familiar with it, right?
yeah. I remember in its very early stages, I used it for my senior project in high
Mm,
school.
yeah, that's cool. Yeah, and overall, OneZoom is a very good resource, and thing it's still mostly pretty accurate. There are a few places where it has become outdated, so I pointed those out to Kurzgesagt, and they were happy to make the changes. And so yeah, so I got to see several iterations. They would send me a draft. I would make some comments. They would send me another one, and I would make some comments. And that went back and forth a couple of times. And I also had a Skype call with them once, so because they wanted to ask for clarifications on some of the things they wanted to include.
Ooh.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It really was. And so in earlier this year, so in January, they released a poster in their online shop, and so you can go on there and order it. So they will be sending me a free version of it. So I think as thanks for the consulting, and so I look forward to receiving mine. And I hear you already received the one that you ordered.
Oh yeah. It had to have been. I remember this to a T. It was like 15 minutes after they put it on Twitter.
Yeah.
I was like done. The website bought it, and so yeah, I do have mine, and yeah, definitely we will we'll put a link in our
Yeah.
description so y'all can go and purchase it. Yeah, it's impressive. It's beautifully formatted. Of course the art style is definitely Kurzgesagt, which is
Yep.
great. And also like the quality of the paper too. Like these posters, like it's very sturdy.
Mm.
Um, like it would take like direct effort to like print it.
Right.
But yeah, no, I'm definitely gonna get like a really nice frame to put it in. Obviously, since we're moving, like I can't put
Right.
it up like I want to now, but definitely gonna do that the moment I get the chance to.
Right. Yeah. That's great to hear. Yeah, because I obviously haven't handled like the physical poster yet, so I didn't know about the paper quality. But yeah, like overall, I'm very pleased with the final result, and it was fantastic to work with them. They were very responsive. They took into account basically all my suggestions. Um, yeah, it is really a fantastic piece of work. Um, and there might be a couple of things I would personally do differently, but they're mostly like pretty subjective things. I really think they did an excellent and fantastic job with it overall. Um, and yeah, so take a look and see if it's to your liking. I am really happy with it.
Yeah, me too. And then I tend to agree with you, but no, like I'm really happy with what we got, and I understand like these posters are usually part of their like educational
Mhm.
approach. They have like the world map and the human body and the periodic table that
That's
they
right.
give to teachers in schools that they can use. So
Yeah.
I'm sure this is going to get a lot of use in helping kids kind of understand, what phylogeny is and
Hmm.
how evolution works. Yeah, definitely fantastic. Um, I was going to mention Albert. As a on another topic,
Hmm.
I understand you had just finished watching A Perfect Planet.
I was going to bring that up next. Yeah. Yeah, fantastic. We're on the same wavelength there. Yeah. So yes, that was kind of the other thing I wanted to mention, like before we got the show properly started, was yeah. So the new kind of BBC Natural History landmark series, A Perfect Planet, just finished airing here in the UK. So what they did this time was actually a little different. So usually BBC makes a lot of its recent shows kind of available on its website on its what they call iPlayer. Unfortunately, it's only available within the UK. So if you're outside of the UK, you would have to go through other means to watch them. But
Yeah, I think they're making it a Discovery Plus exclusive.
right, yeah. Um, but if you're in the UK, you can get the opportunity to watch a lot of BBC shows on iPlayer. And usually, what they do when they're kind of releasing new shows is that they will release episodes on iPlayer simultaneously with them airing on television. But what they did this time was they actually put the whole series on online before the entire series had finished airing. Um, and that was very tempting. But I figured I would pace myself and watch them as low they were airing on, in real time in terms of like television airtime. Um, so I decided to watch one episode a week and kind of follow along like that. And it's a really good series, I think. So I have to say that it wasn't quite exactly what I expected it to be, but it was nonetheless very good. So the premise of the series is that it talks about different forces on Earth that have shaped life, I guess. So, or the I guess the way they put it is different forces that make Earth a perfect planet for life, and that's why the title is the way it is. I have to say that I'm not completely on board with the title. I think it's a little misleading. Uh,
Mhm.
I, that Earth is a perfect planet for life. Like, yeah, it's true that out of the planets near us, Earth is the only one that happened to produce life, and so that's of course because it has, it happened to have the right conditions for it. But also, life is shaped by those forces. I think an analogy that people have used is, it's like the water in a puddle saying that this hole was made for me because I happen to fit it. Um, that I feel like that's a more appropriate analogy for how life fits into how Earth works, I guess. But but nonetheless, that semantics aside, I think it's a very good series, and so each of the episodes is themed around one of these forces, as they say. So I think the first one is about volcanoes, so geothermal energy, and how that influences life, and then the next one is about the sun, and then I think the next one is weather, and then oceans, and the final one is humans, because of course humans are a very powerful force nowadays in
Oh,
terms of
absolutely.
influencing kind of evolution and extinction. Um, and when I heard about the premise of this series, I thought they would focus more on the forces themselves, so that they would talk a lot about like the geologic processes and all that, which is great, and I would definitely be interested in such a series. But they kind of took a bit of a different approach. Well, what they did is that they do talk about the forces, but a lot of the focus is more on the wildlife that is specifically impacted by those forces. So they'll kind of use the adaptations of different animals or the behavior of different animals as kind of a way to show how these forces have shaped life. And I can understand why they did that because people like looking at animals, and I like looking at animals. So I don't think that's really that's not really like a criticism on my part. It just was a little different from what I was expecting. But yeah, what they showed was like absolutely, yeah, absolutely fantastic. Like they 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 did a very good job of showing like there were some some sequences are things that have been shown in previous documentaries before, but others like they were really fresh things that I had not seen before, um, being shown on documentaries like obscure species or obscure behaviors. Um, so let me think what comes to mind. I think my favorite episode was the oceans episode. They show a lot of interesting things there, and there's of course like always a lot of fascinating undocumented behavior from marine life. And I think one of the most memorable moments was them showing a feeding frenzy of reef sharks. I think in Australia maybe, and the reef sharks, they were driving small fish like up towards the beach where they could be easier to catch because it was shallow water. And I've seen similar sequences before in other documentaries, but what was different about this one was that the sharks, they didn't just like go into shallow water. They swam right up onto the beach. Like they would kind of surf onto the beach and catch the fish that were stranded on the sand. If you've seen like Patagonian killer whales in documentaries, kind of surfing onto the beach to catch sea lions, that was kind of what those sharks were doing, which was like incredible because I had never seen anything like that before. And like in addition to the sharks, there were like other predatory fish, and there were seabirds that were also hanging around to take advantage of the fish being concentrated in such large numbers, and that was quite a spectacle to be sure. And I would say another one of my favorite sequences is probably when they showed these really high definition sequences of fig wasps just going through their life cycle. So they started with a female wasp entering a fig. They actually showed like her wings being scraped off in the process,
Oh,
and then she lays her eggs, and the young hatch. The males hatch first, and they mate with the females, and then they also chew a hole in the fig, um, so the females can exit. And also, so apparently the these ants that were waiting outside the fig to hunt the wasp larvae, they would go after the males first, and then in that way, less of the females get preyed upon, which was quite an interesting adaptation. Um, And yeah, they showed all of this in this really high definition footage, which was really cool because of course the kind of the fig and fig wasp mutualism is a classic kind of textbook example of coevolution, but it's very rare to see this depicted in documentaries, probably because fig wasps are really small. They're very hard to film, I would imagine, but they managed to do it in this one. So yeah, that was really cool too. So I think those two are probably my favorite sequences, but there were loads of other great stuff and loads of other great scenes in there, and yeah, so I highly recommend it. I guess the last thing I want to mention is the last episode on humans. I think it was definitely good in terms of like kind of drawing attention to the urgency and the major threats that humans are exerting on the biosphere and by extension ourselves. Um, but it felt pretty different from the rest of the episode, or rest of the series, I should say. Um, like the format was felt pretty different. So they had instead of kind of focusing on how wildlife is like direct like focusing on the wildlife themselves, I guess, and how they're impacted by human forces, they kind of showed talking heads of various experts talking about climate change and kind of uh, how humans are changing the natural environments, things like that. And then they kind of intersperse that with footage of what some people are doing to kind of reduce human impact or kind of restore natural ecosystems. And I thought that was good. It was fantastic to see all of that. I hope it reached a lot of people and inspired them to look into these subjects or maybe do something about these problems. But it definitely felt like it was part of a different series from the rest, a little disconnected. So I guess that's kind of an observation I have. Maybe not necessarily a criticism, but um, something I noticed. Um, but yeah, I guess those are my general thoughts on the series. Do you have anything to add? I know you haven't seen it yet, right?
Yeah, I am way behind on like nature documentary media. Um, that is an interesting observation, though. I mean, talking heads in a David Attenborough
Right.
documentary, that's not something I'm used to for sure.
Me neither. Yeah, it was definitely when they introduced the talking head, I was like, huh, this is different.
Right, and I also hear what you like. I hear what you're saying about like your expectations for the show were
Mhm.
different than what we eventually got, even though it not being a bad thing, of course.
Right.
I think the way you described it was you were thinking like they were going to do like the living planet
Right.
in that sort of way, which I guess I don't know. Would planet Earth kind of count as the living planet too?
That's a good question. Yeah.
Because
Somewhat.
like
Yeah. They
really,
take it's a slightly different approach, but I guess the spirit is more similar, right?
yeah, because I was thinking like that show was divided into habitats.
Right. Right.
I think the living planet was like that too. It's been a hot minute since I've seen it.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right about that.
Um, But hey, yeah, I'm always a sucker for new, really cool HD footage of wildlife that doesn't normally get seen on these
Mhm.
type of shows.
Right.
So I think that'll probably be like the big excitement for me, as it was for like Blue Planet 2
Mhm.
or Seven Worlds, One Planet, which
Oh
have a
yeah.
lot of great footage.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, no, I the last month has not been big in terms of like media consumption in
Mhm.
terms of like natural history stuff. The only thing I can think of that I've been doing is I've been slowly working my way through J.M. Roberts' History of the World,
Oh cool.
the Penguin History of the World. After the Penguin Publishing Company. Not
Right.
the. It's not about penguins. I've seen
I
that joke.
wish.
Yeah, it wasn't be impressive because
Right.
the book is 1,200 pages long. It is a brick. Only 430 pages in, so I got a ways to go. Um, but I've been really enjoying it so far. It's updated, so it's a sixth edition. Roberts died in 2003, so they got somebody else to come and kind of pick up the pen. Let me see if I can get his name properly, because it's one of those situations where who do you get to replace J.M. Roberts and keep the tone the same
Right.
and Odd Arn Westad, who I guess apparently is a huge fan of, J.M. Robertson, read his book in the past, so like he already knew kind of his style of writing, so it kind of worked out. Um, but it's pretty nice, and you can tell like they've updated it in a little bit. It's like the early chapters, of course, with human origins, like they add some of the appropriate stuff, like they talk about the human movements and the new DNA from Neanderthals and Denisovans, for example. But I
Mm.
can also tell a lot of the book hasn't been touched since like the 70s and 80s. Like a lot of the chapters on like Greece and Rome and the Byzantines, yeah, they did not bother to go through and like tweak some things.
Mm.
Like um, Roberts has a tendency to use barbarians
Ah,
unironically. So,
right.
um, but like in general, like despite those little things, I'm very pleased with the format that the book has taken.
Yeah.
It's not one of your standard romps through world history where it's just event, 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 chronology. They do talk a little bit about that, but a huge chunks of the book are just focused on like the anthropology of the different peoples of the past. So like yeah, they talk about Greece, but like what was the average Greek person doing? How do they make money? What's their family structure like? What kind of crops are they growing? What's the relationship between the government and the people? Things like that. And I eat that stuff up, so I've been really, really enjoying it. At the moment, I'm currently reading about Imperial China from the end of the Han to the Qing Dynasty,
Mm.
and so that's been pretty fascinating so far. And the next chapter is on Japan. They finally entered the story, so I'm like, okay, cool.
Wow.
Because yeah, in terms of like the coverage of different peoples, there definitely is a bias.
Mm-hmm.
Robert's one of those where it's like, well, if it's not part of the mainstream,
Mm.
deserves maybe a couple paragraphs at most. So, like, if you're looking for like a comprehensive look at like the pre-Columbian Americas or sub-Saharan Africa, or like the Pacific region, yeah,
Right.
like fleeting glimpses there.
Yeah. Mm.
They often kind of get stuck in these individual chapters where they're like a miscellany, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Which if I was to do a world history, I definitely wouldn't do that sort of thing. But again, it's just that style of history writing from the day, and obviously I know like good resources to get that information from. And,
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of historians are shifting away from that sort of thinking and then making proper world histories, that are about the world and not just what you can cover with your hand on a globe of
Right.
Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's always like the center point of these sorts of stories.
Mm-hmm.
But I've been really enjoying that a lot, and it's gonna be a couple more months of work, I'm sure, to get through it. But I'm really enjoying it. So that's really been the most that I've been doing personally in terms of getting my natural history, human history,
Mm-hmm.
mojo pumping.
Excellent. Excellent.
Everything else. But yeah, so this today's episode is going to be a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Some of you may remember when we used to do instants and reflections. On occasion, when there was like a bunch of stories that we really, really wanted to talk about, but we only had like an hour to fit it all in, we would do like these 2-minute roundups, if you will, where
Right.
we give you the Spark Notes version of a news story and just kind of fire them off to give you like a week in natural history, basically.
Right.
And considering that this show, we don't really have strict time limits to film these things, we figured we'd go ahead and take some time to do that for 2020. Give you guys the our favorite news stories from the whole of 2020,
Mm-hmm.
January to December, and they're in no particular order. And in terms of like content, they are varied. I know when we were talking about what stories to pick, we didn't want to tread a lot of the same ground that I'm sure some of our viewers would have seen. Because I know the paleo community on YouTube, they already did a lot of work for us in
Right.
terms of synthesizing the entire year of 2020 in paleontology and making them as a series of monthly videos. and then splicing them together into this big one long news video,
Right.
which is impressive. So like we're going to try to avoid a little bit of that and focus on maybe some other stories that we feel are just as important and should probably be uplifted out there,
Mm-hmm.
not just in paleontology, but like in general zoology as well. And we're going to do that on top of our January 2021 highlights
Mm-hmm.
to kind of keep the format going. So I think we're excited to kind of jump into that. What do you think, Albert?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. So yes, indeed. So I guess just to briefly recap, yeah, we're gonna run through um, our favorite, or at least a selection of our favorite 2020 stories uh, first, and this we will try to keep each description short. So 2 or 3 minutes. We don't have to be strict about this, but we'll try to keep it short. Um, and so I chose 10 stories, and Joan has chosen 10 stories, and we will kind of alternate until we finish them all. And then after we're done with the roundup, we will do kind of our usual, kind of more focused news reporting, I guess, for various stories from January 2021 and also one from December 2020 as well. So yeah, that's how this episode is going to be a bit different from usual. Um, Let me think. I think I actually have the first of the roundup stories. So before I get properly started, I just wanted to mention that when I started doing this, I wanted to pick 10 stories that I found interesting from dinosaur paleontology, but it turns out that there were a lot of stories that I found interesting about dinosaurs, or especially interesting even about dinosaur paleontology, and I couldn't fit them all in. So I was like, okay, well, I'm mostly into pennaraptoran dinosaurs anyway, so I picked 10 stories about pennaraptoran dinosaurs. And uh, I know we said that we didn't want to retread the same ground as kind of paleo rewind, as they say, but I think because I focus specifically on Manoraptor, some of these stories might have flown under the radar to, I guess, mainstream uh, news outlets. So I think some of them are still worth covering nonetheless. So in any case, I guess I am going to go to the next slide and we can get started.
Well,
Um,
let's
yeah. So if I go over 3 minutes, let me know, but I'll try to keep them under 2 minutes if I can.
okay. You're on the clock.
Great. Okay, so the first story, or I guess this is really a set of stories because several different papers came out on this, or specifically two highlighted here, was that we learned quite a bit more about brooding behavior in Mesozoic pennaraptoran dinosaurs last year. So these are the dinosaurs that include birds, but they also include a lot of the very bird-like relatives, things like the dromaeosaurid, raptor dinosaurs, and the oviraptorosaurs. And we actually talked about one of these papers in our October 2020 episode. So if you want to learn more about it, go check out that episode. But basically, one of these papers, which the figure on the left here was taken from, um, it basically used an experimental kind of approach to see whether these dinosaurs could actually incubate their eggs. Because one thing that early pennaraptorans did differently from modern birds is that they partially buried their eggs in the ground. So part of the egg was exposed, but not all of it. So they couldn't like directly cover the entire egg with their bodies. But with their experimental approach, um, what they found was that yes, even though the eggs were partially buried, potentially a parent sitting on them could still provide additional heat to help them incubate. And so they postulated that they could have gone through this kind of transitional phase where maybe the egg wasn't strongly incubated by body heat, but there was still a body heat component to the incubation, and that's what these early pennaraptorans were doing, which seems pretty plausible to me. And then later in the year, so this is the figure on the right here, a new specimen, a new Oviraptorosaur specimen was described, showing one sitting on top of a nest of eggs. And this one, it was, we have found similar specimens before, but this one was unique because it it was not only an adult sitting on the eggs, but there were also embryos preserved inside the eggs. And what these showed was that the embryos had already reached a pretty late stage of development. So this kind of confirms that these early raptorosaurs, they were sitting on the nest for a long period of time, and that the ones that have been buried, they weren't just, it just happened to be sitting there while they just finished laying the egg or something like that, which people have suggested before. Okay, I think that's it for this set of stories, and you can have the next one.
Sweet. And yeah, you did pretty good. It was around.
Great, thanks.
So I think if we can keep that mojo going, that'd be great.
Right.
Okay, and I'll do my part too.
Sure.
So y'all ever remember this story from our Instance and Reflection segment for the Dino Nerds for Black live stream, which of course we will link to in the description.
Mm-hmm.
This was one of the 2 news stories that I wanted to highlight from that sequence. I wanted to highlight it again because I felt that this was an enormously fascinating paper that shed light on what is otherwise a fairly obscure group of extinct arthropods. So basically, the study served a twofold function: to highlight an amazingly preserved fossil of a species of Euthycarcinoid called Heterocrania rhyniensis, which was found in the Rhynie Chert of Scotland during the early Devonian period. The fossil preserved many details of anatomy that had been a bit of a mystery regarding this clade. Features of the eyes and mouth that we weren't really too sure on. And the second function of this paper was to then take these anatomical characters and compare them to other arthropod groups to kind of understand where they might fit in the overall phylogeny of the group, because there have been a lot of different suggestions over the years, but nothing quite clear cut. And it was determined that Euthycarcinoids are best understood as stem myriapods. Now, this clade, as you may recall, includes centipedes and millipedes and their relatives, so multi-legged, multi-segmented arthropods. Now, what makes this particularly noteworthy is that Euthycarcinoids are semi-aquatic. They are found in deposits that were marine or freshwater, which kind of gives an idea about where they were living. But today's myriapods, as a general rule, are terrestrial animals. And so, with this cladistic relationship, we can get a sense of how the terrestrial myriapods evolved from these water-living ancestors. And this has been added by several trackways that might belong to Euthycarcinoids, that they seem to be strolling along the coasts. So maybe they're going up onto the beach to look for food, or they got washed up there and they were able to walk back. It's an open question. Now, the molecular clock puts the origin of the myriapod lineage between the Ediacaran and the Cambrian period, which is about the time when Euthycarcinoids appear in the fossil record. So time will tell whether we find true myriapod fossils going back this far as well. And that's all I have to say on that.
Great. Yep. All right. So I'm going to do my next story. Last year we also learned quite a bit about flight in Mesozoic pennaraptorans. So the origin of flight in birds is, of course, a hot topic. It's pretty much always been a hot topic, at least insofar as there has been study on it. And there has been a lot of debate about whether or not a lot of these early birds or early bird-like dinosaurs could fly. And last year there was a bunch of new studies that came out on this very subject, and we covered a couple of them back in our August 2020 episode, so go check that one out if you want to learn more. But in any case, one of them is pictured on the left here, and this one basically applied various parameters to try and figure out, or they tried to figure out the parameters for a wide variety of these pennaraptorans and to see which ones were likely to have been able to fly. And what they found was that it is likely, at least given the phylogeny that they found, that flight evolved not just once, but several times within Mesozoic pennaraptorans. So several different lineages evolved the ability to fly independently. It seems that basically early pennaraptorans, it didn't take many changes for one of them to become flight capable, I guess. So it seems that this transition happened several times. Now, whether or not these early pennaraptorans were good at flying is a different matter. So potentially, they probably, on average, weren't as good as a typical flying bird today. Like almost certainly they weren't. But even just being able to fly a little bit in a world where not many other theropods can fly could have potentially been an advantage, especially if those other theropods are trying to eat you. So it's you can easily see how this might have evolved. On the right there was a study specifically about a group called Scansoriopterygids. This group is so far only known from the late Jurassic of China, and they are these really weird pennaraptorans with really long fingers, and some of them preserve evidence of having these membranous wings. So most pennaraptorans have feathered wings, like you see in a modern bird, but Scansoriopterygids have wings made of like skin membranes, a bit like a bat, which is super weird. And so people have wondered how well could these things fly. This study tried to examine that, and what they found was that it is probable that these at least some of these scansaurs could fly. Um, yeah, scansaur is kind of a short nickname a lot of people use for them. They could glide, but they probably could not use powered flight. They don't seem to have many flapping adaptations, but they do seem to have been able to glide. However, even their gliding probably was relatively short duration compared to a lot of modern gliders. Seems that they probably couldn't stay gliding for very long and all that, relatively speaking. So they could glide, but maybe weren't particularly good at it. So that's that story. All right, how about yours?
Oh, okay. Well, that's actually really interesting. I didn't hear about
Oh yeah.
that one. But yes, okay. So this next paper actually came out last month. But I felt that it was important enough to include anyway. The backstory to this, that is to say, the extinction of the megafauna, or large animals over 50 kilograms, is immense, and I don't have enough time to go through it right
Mm-hmm.
now. I'll save most of that further down the line when I do the Human Origins series. But basically, out of all the regions on Earth where human beings settled and lived tens to hundreds of thousands of years ago, those of Africa and Southern Asia managed to hold on to most of their megafauna, while others, the Americas and Oceania especially,
Mm-hmm.
underwent numerous extinctions. Now, the whys of this have led to some major discourse. Did humans settling in these regions kill the megafauna off? Were there climate changes involved? Was it both? Was it neither? That's a good question. But regarding Africa and Southern Asia, one idea has been proposed to explain the lack of major losses in the fossil record. This is the coevolution hypothesis. So maybe the reason why so few large animals died off in these regions is because they had shared their environment with humans for so long that they just got used to them and adapted. Um, Now, this has been tested for Africa, but not so much for Southern Asia, which is where this paper comes in. Quaternary India did not lose much over the past 30,000 years or so. You can see the roster on this chart here. Four animals died out completely, including two species of elephants, a hippo, and a horse, um, while the Indian auroch was domesticated into the zebu breeds that we
Mm-hmm.
have today. So kind of like what happened with the aurochs in the Middle East and in Europe, where the ostrich was made locally extinct. Asia still had ostriches until about the 1900s, but they were more in the West,
Mm-hmm.
in like the Middle East or so. The archaeological record for Homo sapiens in particular in India definitely goes back about 30,000 years, although I'm under the impression that it's highly likely that they were here for a lot longer than
Mm-hmm.
that, to say nothing of other hominins that must have inhabited this region for at least a few million years or so. Um, so the authors argue that the coevolution hypothesis does explain the survival of most of India's megafauna, and they point to a number of factors that might have fared them well. The surviving animals, which you can see here on the right, these are mostly the herbivores. They may have had extensive ranges and stable population densities. They may have lived in places where humans didn't usually encroach upon. Humans themselves may have preferred to go after other smaller prey, and this is actually backed up at least by the archaeological evidence and by some of the ethnographic accounts of the now marginalized indigenous groups in India. So it seems that the megafauna of the Indian subcontinent were lucky in this respect. Most of them were able to hang on into historical times where they get to face new anthropogenic environmental pressures. So,
Right.
woohoo!
Yeah. Wow. That is really interesting. I saw this paper, but I didn't read it in detail. So yeah, that's a really cool study.
Yeah, Pleistocene India is really cool. But
Mm-hmm.
that's all I have to say on that. So
Cool. All
over
right.
to you, Madood.
Great. Okay, so this is kind of another set of papers situation. So, because several papers came out last year looking at molting in Mesozoic paravian dinosaurs. So, paravians is a smaller group than pennaraptora, so it doesn't include the oviraptorosaurs, but it does include birds and dromaeosaurids and troodontids. And so, several papers looked at molting in exceptionally preserved paravian specimens that are preserved with their feathers. And we talked about a couple of these in our July 2020 episode. So one of these studies, the first of them to come out, was on Microraptor, which is pictured on the left. And what they basically found was that Microraptors seemed to exhibit this kind of sequential molting. So one feather would molt out, and the one next to it in the wing would molt, and so on and so forth. And another paper that came out shortly afterward found a similar kind of, or evidence of a similar molting pattern in a paravian called Protopteryx, which was an opposite bird, an enantiornithean. So it is relatively closely related to modern birds. And then later in the year, a third study came out on Archaeopteryx. And what they found was that Archaeopteryx also seemed to have sequential molting, but in a somewhat different way. In one of the specimens of Archaeopteryx they examined, which is pictured on the right here, what they found was that it had a center out sequential molting strategy. So one feather from the middle would molt out, and then the two next to it would start molting, and then kind of the sequence would move kind of outward and inward, spreading out from the original feather that molted. And they found evidence of this on both wings of this Archaeopteryx specimen, so it seems like it's a real thing. So that's really interesting. And sequential molting is commonly found in birds today that need to maintain their flight capabilities like throughout the year, so they can't spend some of the time flightless. So that's why they only molt kind of this one feather at a time, so that they can maintain a more or less continuous wing surface. And that is interesting because all of these paravians that have been examined for this so far are thought to have been likely capable of flight, based especially on some of those studies that I mentioned just earlier. So it would be interesting to see if we could find any evidence of kind of what kind of molting that flightless Mesozoic paravians were using, but I guess that'll have to wait for other studies. And I guess that's all I have to say about that one.
Oh, that's awesome. All right then. So, this one's really, really cool.
Yes.
So this paper came out in June 2020, and it regards an extinct stem marsupial, Thylacosmilus. Now, as you can see in the restoration to the right, it sort of resembles a saber-toothed cat, or what's known as a macarodont. And indeed, it has been argued for the longest time as being convergently evolved with these animals, which means that Neogene South America featured a large predatory megatherian that would go after prey and kill it by applying pressure to the windpipe with these large canine teeth. Well, this reconstruction has been sort of taken for granted over the years, so the authors of this paper decided to actually look at the anatomy of Thylacosmilus and see whether it actually did behave in this way. They performed biomechanical studies on the skull, and they looked closely at the microwear on the teeth themselves, and then compared that to saber-toothed cats and other animals as well. And it turns out that Thylacosmilus did not match up with the saber-toothed cats at all. In fact, it had quite a distinct cranial anatomy, which we can see in the image here in the middle. Most notably, the teeth show a general resistance to stress that is a lot stronger than that which is seen in saber-toothed cats. It looks like that they had the ability to actually grab flesh with their canine teeth and pull it backwards. Now, this is in contrast to their distant placental relatives on the left here, who they could really only stab through the hollows of a prey animal's throat. If they tried to pierce directly into the muscle, well, their teeth could snap off really. In terms of dental microwear, it actually looks like Thylacosmilus was feasting on softer meat. They would have avoided chewing on the bones themselves, and this is sort of similar to cheetahs do, which the authors point out. But cheetahs don't look like that. So it's a bit of an open question as to just what this animal was doing ecologically. While the stress tests show the ability to pull back flesh, there doesn't seem to be the ability to actually stab and kill prey with the large canines. But they would have been great for ripping into the gut cavities of prey. And so the authors looked at modern analogs, and they actually cited the thylacine,
Hmm.
or what's usually known as Tasmanian tiger, as a close match for this behavior. Because like they it was reported that they would go after prey animals and mostly go after the soft underbellies of their prey and eat the guts from there. So maybe this is what Thylacosmilus was doing. It actually kind of lived like their fellow Metatherian
Hmm.
relative. But then there's also the matter of the lack of incisor teeth. Saber-toothed placental carnivores have them, and they presumably use them to kind of help tear at flesh. So, what about Thylacosmilus that didn't have these upper teeth here? And again, that is an open question. The authors point to living mammals that lack incisors. Um, in particular, they looked at ant and termite eaters,
Hmm.
um, Myrmecophagous species, I think that's what the term is, and also the walrus. And they made a suggestion that perhaps what this animal was doing was that it had a really large tongue, and they would use it with their canines to kind of suck up the organs of their prey into their mouth, um, and that's really unique, I think. Um, and just looking at the postcranial anatomy really quickly, the authors argued that Thylacosmilus was not an ambush predator,
Hmm.
and it wasn't a long distance pursuit hunter. So they had the suggestion that based on the powerful forelimbs and the lack of retractable claws, maybe Thylacosmilus was hunting like a bear.
Hmm.
It would lunge at prey, knock it over, pin it down, and then go to the soft underbelly with the canines. Um, so yeah, in conclusion, there's a lot of questions, and
Right.
there definitely are more tests that need to be done. But it seems pretty clear that Thylacosmilus is, not a Metatherian version of a saber-toothed
Hmm.
cat. It was living its life in a completely unique way that we just don't have in the present day.
Right. Yeah. Were you done?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But before I go on to my next story, I guess I just wanted to say that I've been waiting for the study to come out for a long time, because when I was doing my master's studies at the University of Bristol back in 2016, I took a class that was partially taught by the lead author of the study, Christine Janis, who is a well-known mammal paleontologist. And back then, when she was doing one of her lectures, she brought a cast of a Thylacosmilus skull and showed us that she pointed out all the features. I said, look, a lot of this is very different from what you'd expect if this thing was basically a saber-tooth analog. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And so I was just waiting and waiting for the study to be published, and finally it was published last year. So I was very pleased to see that. I know like exactly what Thylacosmilus was doing is probably going to be a controversial question, and I'm sure there will need a lot more studies to even try and figure that out. But I do think the case is pretty convincing that it is not doing the same thing as something like Smilodon was.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, that yeah, I was definitely happy about this one.
That's awesome.
All right. Okay. Now I'm going to go to my next story. Okay. Ontogenetic niche shifts in Deinonychus. Yeah. We also covered this one for our Dino Nerds for Black Lives segment. And basically, what this one looked at was looked at isotopes in juvenile and adult specimens of Deinonychus. And Deinonychus, of course, is a dromaeosaurid. In fact, is often cited as the inspiration for the Velociraptor in Jurassic Park in terms of like the size and all that. And there has been a long-standing hypothesis that Deinonychus was a pack hunter that brought down large prey in groups, and this study potentially has implications for that. What it found was that juvenile Deinonychus were not feeding on the same food as the adults were. What the juveniles were feeding on were species higher on the food chain than the adults. So maybe adults were feeding on herbivorous dinosaurs, for example, whereas the juveniles might have been eating small, say, lizards or mammals that were eating insects, and then those insects would be eating plants, so they would be feeding higher on the food chain in that respect, which is more similar to kind of the feeding strategy of something like crocodilians, which today the juveniles would go after relatively small prey, and then they kind of graduate to larger prey as they grow older. And so this suggests at least a different kind of social structure from what we'd expect from pack hunting mammals today, where the juveniles are usually feeding on the same things as the adults. And so they suggested that this suggests that that Deinonychus was not hunting in a mammal-like hunter manner. Of course, there are other possibilities, like maybe the adults were the ones pack hunting and the juveniles weren't and doing their own thing. So, either way, I think it's a very interesting bit of insight into the lifestyle of Deinonychus, regardless of what it says about the social structure. Um, yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that one, actually.
I love these sorts of studies where
Yeah,
they give you like evidence of social behavior in dinosaurs. I think that's just so cool.
right.
So alrighty then, for you mammal taxonomy buffs out there, this February 2020 paper is for you. This was a huge study that incorporated whole genomes, mitochondrial DNA, and Y chromosomal DNA, cover all the bases, to chart the phylogenetic history of the red panda,
Mm.
which is today the only living member of a clade Ailuridae, which used to range all across Eurasia, and they even ventured to the Americas for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I am obliged to say this. The red panda and the giant panda have nothing to do with each other beyond the fact that they're caniforms with convergent anatomical features.
Mm.
The red panda was described first by science in 1843. That's why the giant panda is named as such, because it was thought to be a close relative.
Mm-hmm.
Giant panda is, in fact, a bear. We're probably better off referring to it as a panda bear from now on. I'm going to keep pushing this until it sticks. While the red pandas are an offshoot of a larger clade of Mustaloidea, so raccoons, skunks, and weasels, and all those guys. So there we go. Red pandas, giant pandas, not the same thing. Okay. Incidentally, the red panda was for a long time considered to be a single species with two subspecies. You have the Chinese and the Himalayan red pandas. And as you can see in the image to the left, they're fairly similar, but you can see distinctions in things like the coat coloration, maybe the shape of the skull. And it turns out that the differences between the two are more than skin deep, as the study revealed. Roughly 3 million years separate the two subspecies, and the authors argue that these should be elevated to full species, meaning that the name Ailurus fulgens, which usually refers to the whole of the red pandas, should refer specifically to the Himalayan red panda, while the Chinese red panda gets the name Ailurus stiani. And since their split, the two have undergone very distinct trajectories, going through various population bottlenecks and range expansions in response to like the movements of glaciers during the last ice age. What has kept the two species separated was determined by the authors to have been the, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, the Yalu Zangbu River, which flows through Tibet. So all the other separations like mountain ranges and other rivers, they were inconsequential, but this main river here was the big one that kind of kept these two pandas apart from each other. More studies need to be done, of course, to confirm or deny this proposal, but if it turns out to be legitimate, well then of course there are big implications for conservation work.
Right.
Now we're not just dealing with one species in decline, we have two that are even more in decline. So
Right.
you gotta figure this out soon, and either way, like just make sure that these animals have a home.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that's it on that.
Alrighty. Yeah, that was an interesting one. Okay, my next story. Yes. So we talked about this one in our November 2020 episode. So this is a really weird new dinosaur that came out last year. It was named Falcatakely, which means little scythe bearer, as in the farming tool. And the reason it's called that is because it's known from this really nicely preserved, nearly complete though not quite, skull. And it's a really weird skull with this really tall kind of snout that is not seen in any other dinosaur we know of. So there have been a lot of superficial comparisons to things like toucans and hornbills, but it's not quite like that either. Especially the fact that in modern birds, the bone at the front of the snout, called the premaxilla, is the one that is particularly enlarged, but in this dinosaur, it is the maxilla, which is the bone directly behind it, that is more enlarged and makes up most of the snout. So very, very odd. It was found in the late Cretaceous of Madagascar, which was already an island at the time, so we actually have found various kind of weird Cretaceous creatures there, and this is kind of the latest in the roster. And in their phylogenetic analysis, they found Falcatakely as a member of the enantiornithean, or the opposite birds, which were a group of very diverse and very bird-like dinosaurs from the Cretaceous. But since it is only known from a skull, and not many late Cretaceous enantiornithians have preserved skulls, it is actually pretty hard to be sure whether it really was one or not. And some other people have kind of informally, not yet published, but informally made suggestion that it might be some other kind of theropod, which I think is entirely possible. It's very, very hard when you're dealing with limited material of a very weird organism. Very hard to tell exactly what it is. So it could turn out that it's something else. But no matter what it is, it's a very weird theropod for sure, and I think it's definitely one of the highlights of the new dinosaurs that we got from last year. Yeah, I think that's my spiel on that. You want to do yours?
Yeah, absolutely. I still love like the whole meme that had been associated with this thing. They were calling it the Toucan Sam.
Yeah, right.
Probably not the case at all.
Yeah, right.
Um, but anywho, this is another fun paper from
Yes.
August of last year. We have a new world record for mammals.
Yay.
Honor of being the one that has managed to inhabit the highest range it is possible for a mammal to go is, drumroll please, the yellow-rumped, leaf-eared mouse.
Ooh.
This funky little critter, Phyllotus xanthopygus rupestris, is a sigmodontine, which is this enormous radiation of American mice and rats that also includes a number of other really interesting species. You've got fish-eating rats and cotton rats and the bolo mice and the arboreal rice rats and all the rodents that managed to colonize the Galapagos Islands.
Yeah.
I just wanted to name drop all these guys because their names are fun to say.
Yes.
We could easily do a whole show on just this group alone.
Right.
They're so fascinating. But anyway, an individual of this species was discovered by the authors 6,739 meters atop the summit of Ucayalipithecus, which is a dormant volcano that borders Chile and Argentina. Now, what's significant about this world record is that, well, it further pushes the border of how much a mammal can tolerate at such a height. I mean, this little mouse is able to withstand low oxygen, extremely cool temperatures that would otherwise kill or at least harm other mammals. And so the biggest question now is, how do they do it? What is their lifestyle like? What are they eating? Because this mouse is found at a level of elevation that is over 2,000 meters above where plants are able to grow. So, what are they eating? Bugs or something? It's insane. Now, for the record, the previous holder of this title went to the large-eared pika, which is lagomorph. So that's the living sister clade to the rodents, where you find like rabbits and hares. And that was found 6,130 meters up. In this case, this is up the face of Mount Everest in the Himalayas. So yeah, we're talking about a bump of something like over 600 feet between these two mammals. So it's really impressive. I look forward to hearing more about the lifestyle of these mice. And as you can see, I took a screenshot best I could because on the paper there's two videos. It's an online paper, of course. There's two videos showing the authors locating this mice and like it's so funny. The one guy's like, "There's a mouse. I don't see a mouse. There's a mouse right there. Where's the mouse? I don't see it." And eventually they go under a rock and they grab this little mouse who's like, "No." And they're able to get the confirmation, like, "Yep, we have a mouse."
Wow.
So I encourage you all to check it out.
That's amazing. Wow. Yeah. Where was that your summary?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm good. I'm good.
Good. Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I read this paper, but I hadn't seen the video. That sounds really funny. And yeah, as I've mentioned on the show before, like I'm a dinosaur guy, but I love rodents, and so of course I'm very happy to hear that this record has been taken by a rodent. But I would not have expected any of this because rodents kind of have done a bit of everything. So yeah. If it's going to be a mammal world record, like chances are, pretty decent that a rodent's going to take it.
Right, turns out the blue whale's actually a rodent all along.
The scientific name, as you might know, or part of it is like musculus is like a small mouse or something. Which is, I think it was meant to be ironic, but yeah. So
humor right there.
Right. Very prescient. Anyway, yeah, in any case, let's go to my next story. Okay, so this next story is about a bird called Calciavis from the Eocene of North America. It belongs to a group called the lithornithids, which are closely related to the ostriches and emus and kiwi and so on, except lithornithids were mostly much smaller than those living paleonate birds, as we say, and they could fly. And in fact, they could probably fly very well. Studies have been done on their possible flight style, and they could probably fly something like the way like ducks do today, the continuous flapping flight. So yeah, they were pretty different from the modern paleonates in that respect. And so this study looked at coloration in Calciavis because in some specimens the feathers are preserved, as you can see here. And so, as is often the case for these color studies, what they did was they looked at melanosomes. These are pigment pockets, pigment cells, pigment-containing organelles in the cells that can be preserved in exceptional cases. And so looking at the shape of these melanosomes, you can sometimes tell what kind of color they would have produced. And as it turns out, they found that in Calciavis, these melanosomes were probably used for structural colors, a kind of iridescence or glossy color, which is not color that is produced directly by the pigments themselves or by light reflecting off the pigments themselves, but instead by the structure of the feather. And so what happens is that the pigments will absorb some wavelengths of light when it's producing structural color, but some of the light gets bounced off by the structure of the feather itself, by air pockets or things like that, and then that shows a certain kind of color, and that's how iridescence is formed. That's often how colors like blue is formed in the natural world. And it seems to be a case that Calciavis had these glossy or iridescent colors, which is very unusual because most paleonates living today do not. Something else that this paper brought up was that they looked at how cassowaries produce glossy color, because cassowaries, if you look at them, they're kind of black feathers, have kind of a shiny sheen to them, and so people have wondered, how do they do that? And it turns out that cassowaries use a type of glossy mechanism that is different from what's seen in other birds. So the central shaft of their feather is very large. A modern bird's feathers or a typical flight feather, you can see a central shaft running down the middle with the smaller branches coming off of it. And so the central shaft in a cassowary feather is particularly large. And so what that allows it to do is it can bounce off more light that way, forming a bigger surface. And that's how they form the glossiness. So this paper basically found two different ways that paleonates have, evolved to produce structural coloration that are very different from each other and had not been previously appreciated. So that was pretty cool. All right, I think we can go back over to you now.
All right, that's awesome though.
Yeah.
So I briefly talked about this study in this April 2020 study during episode 2 of my Human Origins series, in the context of the primate settlement of South America. It's well known that the ancestors of the New World monkeys, or platyrians, first inhabited Africa before making their way to South America around 40 million years ago. They were probably able to do so most likely by clinging to these great rafts of floating vegetation that washed off the West African coast and landed in the Americas over a brief period. As you can see to the map on the right, the continents were a lot closer than they are today during that time. Island hopping has been proposed, but based on the lifestyles of these animals, it seems very unlikely. Well, it turns out that thanks to some new fossils from Santa Rosa in the Peruvian Amazon, platyrians weren't the only primates that made the trip. Cladonistic analysis of the bones has shown that this new species, Ucayalipithecus perdita, belongs to a now extinct lineage called the parapithecidae. These are not closely related to any living groups, as you can see to the phylogeny on the left. They branched off before the split between the American platyrians and the Afro-Eurasian catarrhines, to whom we belong. The study suggests that these primates made it to South America between about 35 and 32 million years ago, during a period when the sea levels were significantly lower than they are today, although they most likely would have made it across via this vegetation rafting thing that the platyrians must have gone through. Now, the fossils, interestingly, they show some very derived features from other parapithecids that are known, and that the authors suggest that this group actually managed to hang out in South America for quite a while and evolved their own distinctions. Um, but in the end, there aren't any of these left in the world today. So it's highly likely that at some point there was competition
Hmm.
with platyrines, and that sealed their fate. Um, so that's all I have to say on this particular paper.
All right. Wow. But yeah, that is pretty remarkable that it might have happened twice. Yeah, you think of how that these kinds of events, how improbable they are, but we just keep finding evidence of them happening, and that, yeah, really cool.
Right, right. I guess I should also mention, as an aside, like, yeah, these two primate lineages weren't the only critters that must have made this journey. As Albert alluded to,
Mhm.
the caviomorphs,
Right. Mhm.
which is a group of rodents where you get like the guinea pig and the capybara and so
Mhm.
forth. Like their ancestors made that east to west trip too. Um, and apparently, I guess I didn't write too much about this, but like you might have noticed in the map on the right, there's a lizard on a log there. Um, I guess some lineage of lizards actually made the reverse trip to Africa and
Yeah.
probably Europe as well.
Yeah, that has been suggested. I recall that. Yeah. So keeps happening, and
Yeah,
as yeah,
at highway.
right, right. Yeah, and as I mentioned in one of the dinosaurs, the second chapters episodes, we have some evidence of this happening in a group of birds too. So the Hoatzin today, its ancestors, might have also crossed from Africa directly to South America on a similar kind of journey. So, yep, keeps happening.
Yeah. Alrighty, let's pass it over to you, my dude.
Sure thing. All right, so the next one is also about lithornithids. Um, and this one deals with another interesting feature of lithornithids is that they have these very long, kind of narrow beaks that people have suggested that maybe they were probing for food in soil or in like the sand next to bodies of water, things like that. Um, and so this study, it basically looked at a wide variety of modern birds, and it found that in a lot of modern birds that use this kind of similar kind of probing feeding style, they often have very sensitive bill tips, and they can basically detect the vibrations of their prey using their bill tip, even without directly touching their prey. So they just stick their beak in the sand or in the soil, and they can detect their prey and try to go after it. And what they found was that you can identify when a bird has this kind of beak by the kind of number and the patterning of the tiny little pits on at the end of its beak skeleton. And so the birds that don't have this kind of ability have a very different patterning from those that do. And furthermore, what they found is that a lot of modern paleognaths have this kind of pitting, but they do not have a functional kind of this kind of touch sense that the probing birds do, except in the kiwi, which does use this feeding method. So on the top left here is a kiwi skull, and it has these little pits that it uses to forage with. And in the top right here is a tinamou, which is a modern paleognate that does not probe a feed, but it still has these pits. Um, and then they looked at the thornithids, which, as I mentioned in the Paleognate episode of Dinosaurs, the second chapter, appear to likely have been stem paleognates. And it turns out that they had these pits on their beak cyclists. And so, combined with the evidence from the shape of the beak itself, it seems like lithornithids were capable of this kind of tactile probe feeding. And furthermore, it may be that something like a lithornithid gave rise to the modern paleognates, and in many of the lineages, secondarily lost this kind of ability, but they still have the pitting on their beaks. So this was a really fascinating study that tells us something both about like extinct birds and also how modern birds evolved. So that was really cool. It's good to see lithornithids getting more attention.
Yeah, I'll say they're certainly still a little bit unfamiliar to me, but thanks to you, I've been knowing more about them. So I
That's
appreciate
good to hear.
it.
All right. Yeah, we can go to your story now.
Alrighty. So yeah, it's always nice to see our oldest family member here. This is Sahelanthropus chidensis, who represents the earliest known hominin living between 7 and 6 million years ago in present-day Chad in Africa. Of course, you can get the whole story of this species in episode 3 of my series, where I talk in detail about the earliest transitions following the phylogenetic split from the chimps. In short, it has been proposed that the earliest hominins spent a significant amount of time in trees, using their arms and legs to clamber through the branches, yet they did have the ability to move about bipedally on occasion, and this is possible on the ground as well as in the trees. Um, for the longest time, our only frame of reference for Sahelanthropus was a fairly poorly preserved but mostly complete skull and some jaw and teeth material. The computer modeling that has been done on the skull, which attempted to kind of fix it a bit, seemed to show that the foramen magnum, or the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord attaches, was located vertically under the skull, which is usually associated with animals that walk bipedally, although this has been called into question, as I explained in our very first news stories of this entire show, which you can link to that as well. However, when these fossils were unearthed back in 2001, there was more than just a skull that was found. Associated at the same site were some fragmentary limb bones. One left femoral shaft and two right and left ulnae. So these are bones of the thigh and forelimbs, respectively. And despite the obvious uncertainty about their association, the most likely case is that these do belong to Sahelanthropus chigensis. Now, despite over 2 decades of time between excavation, these limb bones have finally been described, at least in the preprint stage. Yeah, even as even after discussing this find back in episode 3, they're still in the preprint stage today. It's been a couple of months. So, as always, we exercise caution when talking about these bones. We still have to see if the analysis holds up to peer review. Still, though, I thought it was big enough to mention anyway. I mean, again, these bones have been waiting almost 2 decades to be talked about.
Right.
So, what do they reveal? Well, in short, if these limb bones do belong to Sahelanthropus, well, they appear to add confirmation then to this hypothesis that the earliest hominins were capable of bipedalism, but still relied mostly on extended limb clambering through the trees for most of their daily activity. Time will tell, of course, especially if we manage to find more material of this species, which is always welcome because hominin bones of a lot of different species, yeah, we need bigger sample sizes.
Right.
Test some of these models because, my goodness, there's one thing anthropologists love to argue about is hominin bones.
Indeed.
That's all I'll say on that for now.
Cool. Yeah, definitely very nice to see the light of day, and hopefully we see the final kind of peer-reviewed version eventually. All right. Yep. Let's go to my next story. Okay. So next story is about a new fossil bird, and the thing you should know about this one is that fossils of hawks and their relatives are pretty rare, or at least they're not often complete. So we have some pretty good ones from places like the La Brea tar pits, which date to the Pleistocene. But the further back you go, there aren't that many good fossils of hawk-like raptors that we know of. So this find is actually a pretty big deal. This is a hawk from the Oligocene, so it's a Paleogene bird, and they named it Aviraptor longicrus. So the long-legged bird thief. It was found in Poland in a rock unit that has been increasingly known to provide us with these really nice bird fossils. And you can see here that, yeah, the bones are pretty flattened, but there's essentially a complete skeleton there. And something interesting about Aviraptor is that it's very small. So it's about as small as the smallest hawks today. So things like the aptly named tiny hawk from the Neotropics. So very small bird. Like it's about the size of an American robin or something like that, thrush sized. So it was probably going after other small animals and maybe especially other small birds. So it has relatively long hind limbs for its body size, and this is a commonly seen characteristic of bird hunting raptors. It is notable that in the Oligocene of Europe, we actually have fossils of early passeriform birds, or poaching birds, and also early hummingbirds. And so it could have been that Aviraptor was going after these other small birds that was living alongside. And so this is a really cool specimen, one of the best examples of a fossil raptor. And yeah, I didn't see it get much press, so I am mentioning it here. All right. Do you want to go to your next one?
Sure. That's really awesome, though. I like new fossils of birds from living groups.
Right.
flesh out that early history a bit, which is
Absolutely.
always appreciated. Um, so yeah, so this is another February paper, and yeah, I have a current preference to kind of leave out most paleoanthropology news until I kind of discuss it in its proper context in my series.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as like those sorts of discoveries go for 2020, I felt that this one was fascinating enough to at least warrant a mention here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as you might know, if you have even a casual interest in human evolution, you know that Homo sapiens has interbred with a number of related human species in the past, most notably with the Neanderthals and their mysterious sister species, the Denisovans. Now, these humans only died out relatively recently in time, and so we've been able to get uh, DNA from these bones through tireless extraction of their remains, and we can kind of look to see the details of their evolution that we would otherwise miss. And the usual consensus when you compare their DNA to ours in the past and in the present was that around 70,000 years ago or so, Homo sapiens groups expanding their range beyond the African continent came into contact with Neanderthals living in Southwest Asia, where they interbred and subsequently affected the genetic history of Eurasia, Oceania, and the Americas. And, all Homo sapiens who are not immediately descended from indigenous African populations are thus supposed to carry a fraction of Neanderthal DNA. Of course, there have been movements of Eurasian peoples into Africa in recent times. Think about like the Arab expansions in the late 600s AD, for example, which would have introduced minuscule amounts of Neanderthal DNA into the African groups living there. At least that was the main consensus view before this study.
Hmm.
So, using DNA samples from a Neanderthal that lived before the known intermixing events with emergent Eurasian Homo sapiens, along with a couple, thousand living human genomes, which is always helpful, it was revealed that there was actually a large amount of Neanderthal DNA in living African peoples. Not only that, this DNA seems to have aided with physiological adaptations to the people living there. There's been a lot of talk in the press about, what did the Neanderthals and Denisovans give Homo sapiens, in their development as a modern species today.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems that there are in particular, uh, adaptations to the immune system and the way that skin fights against UV radiation that contributed to some of the human groups living there. And this was a big surprise to the authors. There are at present no known Neanderthal fossils on the African continent. The closest location are, well, besides the ones on the Strait of Gibraltar, those in the Levant, which those were the ones that would have met our expanding sapiens groups around 70,000 years ago. So, how were they able? How do you able to explain these DNA results?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we ignore the whole discourse around the whole out of Africa model, which I'll definitely get into as I move forward in my series. The most likely model, based on the evidence, is this: as our species spread further into Eurasia and met up with Neanderthals, some of us did eventually start moving back into the African continent afterwards, relatively quickly afterwards. You remember that for these humans, they would not have recognized Europe and Africa and Asia as distinct land masses. Like this was just home for them, really. The genetic data on that aspect points to this sort of intermixing occurring after sapiens had spent a significant amount of time adapting to various conditions in Eurasia. So, meaning that genes had already emerged that were commonly found in, but not exclusive to, groups in Europe and in Eastern Asia, for example. And so the authors point to European populations entering the African continent sometime after 45 to 35,000 years ago.
Hmm.
So that's quite early for people to be going back into the continent, which, if you follow the consensus view, is not usually supposed to have been the case until much later in history. But the authors do make a big point to argue that we really do need to consider these back and forth movements when discussing intermixing. We're probably missing large signals such as this one in our data sets.
Right.
So I thought that was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. It's always cool to get a clearer picture of the very complex kind of genetic history that us and our close relatives have had. Yeah, definitely a really fascinating study. All right. Shall we go to my next story?
Absolutely.
All right. Okay, so here there was a story about the skull anatomy of an extinct owl species. Otis mirivorus, which was a recently extinct owl species. So it died out in historical times. There are historical records of it, and lived on the island of Rodriguez in the Indian Ocean. And it was actually part of a radiation of these owls from islands near that region as well. There were early records of it said that it mostly hung out in trees, but we don't actually know that much about its biology. So this study decided to take a look at its skull anatomy and specifically its brain. And so what they found was that they basically looked at the endocast, so the inside of the brain cavity, and from there you can usually get a pretty good idea of what the brain of a bird looks like. And what they found was that it has some interesting features that aren't commonly seen in other types of owls. And so, shown here in this figure is a comparison between this extinct owl and a modern owl. So the one on the left is the extinct Otis mirivorus owl, and on the right is a living owl from the same genus. And they basically, by making comparisons, they could draw some conclusions about the biology of the extinct Otis mirivorus. And some of their conclusions were that uh, it seemed to have a relatively large olfactory lobe, which is interesting. So the region of the brain that has to do with the sense of smell. And in most owls, this is not particularly well developed, but in this species it was. And they suggested that maybe it was doing quite a bit of scavenging on these islands I was living on, which is not a very super common behavior among owls. Like owls will scavenge sometimes, but it's not that commonly recorded. Whereas there might have been a bigger part of the biology in this species. Something else they also suggested was that it might have, despite early reports, it might have spent a fair amount of time on the ground as well, and it had probably also held its head in a less upright posture compared to typical owls. So that's also pretty interesting. Now, there has been some debate about the reliability of trying to infer head posture from like some of the features of the inner ear, which was used here in different animals. But still, what we are seeing is clearly it was doing something different from what you expect of owls of this genus. So in any case, it's interesting to get a look at this very recently extinct bird that we don't know much about. Okay, I think that's all I have to say about that one.
Wow, yeah, a fairly ground living scavenging owl. That
Right.
not
Yeah.
usually
Curious.
what you think about when you think of owls.
Right. Indeed. Indeed.
Hmm. Alrighty then. Yeah, I guess to continue here, this is another story that we've talked about before on
Right.
our autumn 2020 show. Um, Given how fragmentary most remains are for titanosaurs, to have something like this is just incredible, and
Mm-hmm.
I definitely wanted to highlight it again.
Right.
Um, Now, it needs reiterating that this is currently one of the best preserved remains of a sauropod embryo
Mm.
that we have. Even more special in that they belong to a relatively enigmatic group of dinosaurs.
Right.
Like most titanosaur remains are scrappy. You know, there's all sorts of unanswered questions about things like overall anatomy and especially phylogeny. Um, so to have like this little unhatched dinosaur that that'll be a big help in understanding these animals as a whole. So what are we looking at here? Well, most everything is present on the skull that should be, as well as some features that surprise the authors. The eyes, for example, they're oriented on the skull, not in the way that is typical of sauropods. They're stereoscopic.
Right.
The authors speculate that the babies, after hatching, would have relied on this binocular vision to help them detect predators while they fed. Of course, we have no way to test that, but it's an interesting idea. Many young animals often have unique features compared to their parents that help with their particular modes of life. So certainly, sauropods might have been doing something different from their huge adult selves.
Right.
Um,
Mm.
and the other neat thing about this titanosaur skull is that it's monocerotic. Uh, there's this weird horn-like structure protruding from the front of the snout. Now, at present, we have no idea what this could have been used for. It doesn't appear to be in the proper position to be an egg tooth, which is used for helping to crack open the egg when the animal's hatching. So time will tell what this thing was. But either way, this embryo is absolutely amazing, and it certainly has a lot to teach us about baby sauropods
Right.
and sauropods in general. I would think. Um, so that's my brief word on that.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. All right. Let's see what my next one is. Okay, I think this is my last story actually. So, yeah, we're almost at the end of the roundup here.
Woohoo!
Yay! Okay, so this one I saved for the end because it was one that I was involved in. So we described a new fossil bird from the late Cretaceous that we named Asteriornis maastrichtensis. And this fossil is quite exceptional for several reasons. So first of all, it is a really, really complete skull, and there are a few other bones too, but really the skull steals the show. It's a nearly complete skull and preserved in 3 dimensions, which is extremely rare for bird fossils. So that is excellent. The other thing is that it is from the late Cretaceous and is a crown bird, so it's a modern type bird. Um, Now, in the past, there have been a number of specimens suggested to be crown birds from the Cretaceous, but most of them are, pretty ambiguous. It's pretty hard to be sure that they are crown birds. But this one, because we have basically a complete skull to look at, we can be pretty confident that this is a crown group bird. And a third reason is quite significant, is that it seems to be, an approximation of the last common ancestor of all gallo-anserans. So this is a clade that includes both chickens and ducks. So this is basically our best look at what the ancestral gallo-anseran looked like. And it turns out that it combines some features of the skull of both, duck-like birds, anseriforms, and chicken-like birds, the galliforms. And so, what did the last common ancestor of chickens and ducks look like? Well, it turns out a little like a bit of both. Um, so that it made quite a big news splash, if I may say so. We gave it a pretty catchy nickname called the Wonder Chicken, so that that kind of resonated with people. And if you want to hear or yeah, if you want to learn more about Asteriornis in detail, including the discovery of it and the other interesting information that it can tell us, I talked a bit more about it in the Dinosaurs, the second chapter. It featured in 2 episodes so far. So episode 1 on kind of crown bird origins, and episode 3 on Gallo-anserans specifically. I've also written a blog post describing, kind of summarizing our paper and telling the story of its discovery. So, if you want to learn more about it, check those out. And then with that, I think we can go on to your final roundup story.
Yeah, and it's funny how this kind of worked out because
Right.
speaking of chickens, um, yeah, who doesn't love chickens, right? I mean, there's about 24 billion of them in the world today, so at least we're used to them.
Yeah, right, right.
Now, of course, like all domesticated animals, they had wild ancestors with histories of their own. But in the case of the chicken, there are still some mysteries to their origin. Fortunately, unlike say cows or horses, we still have proper wild chickens roaming around in the world. In fact, there's about 4 species of jungle fowl that roam across India and Southeast Asia, and there's been a general consensus that chickens descend from one or maybe more of these species. Um,
Mhm.
the earliest domestic chickens in the archaeological record were found in northern China, and these go back about 10 to 8,000 years ago to the early millet growing cultures along the Huanghe or the Yellow River. What's particularly interesting about this is that jungle fowl today, well, they don't live in northern China.
Mm.
So they must have had a wider range in the past, or maybe they were brought there somehow. So, yeah, to conclude my 2020 Roundup stories, I wanted to highlight this paper, which came out last year, and it attempted to kind of use a phylogenetic analysis to unveil, the history of domestic chickens. So this study analyzed over 800 genomes from living chickens all across the world, both wild and domestic, to try to see if phylogeny could help pinpoint the who and the where of domestication.
Mm.
In brief, the authors singled out a particular subspecies of the red jungle fowl, so Gaius spadicius, being the likely ancestor of the domestic chicken. And this subspecies today lives in Myanmar and borders China and Thailand from there. The authors argue that the immediate ancestors of domestic chickens split off from these birds anywhere from 12,800 to 6,200 years ago. So yeah, quite a range of time there. Um, at some point during this period, and after their initial domestication, they spread out from their range, and they likely interbred with other jungle fowl species, and only became what you consider fully domesticated as agriculture spread into Southeast Asia from China around 4,500 years ago. Now, that certainly adds a curious spin into things. The range of dates uncovered in the study do match up fairly well to the archaeological record. Of course, the proposed location of origin is quite a ways away from the sites in northern China where chickens first spring up in the rock record. You know, if they really were domesticated first in Southeast Asia prior to the arrival of agriculture, then their use must have proved really popular with people, and it just spread across Asia quickly through population expansions or trade. Um, Now, one criticism of this study is that there is a notable lack of ancient DNA
Mm.
from chickens that was used in the study. It was all from living chickens today. Um, and so, if we had some of that, it might help clarify this model that the authors propose. But until then, at least we have a hypothesis that can kind of guide further research.
Mhm.
Uh, so maybe we're not too far away from, actually having a good history of the domestic chicken,
Right.
which certainly deserves a proper history.
Right, right. Cool. Yeah, and yeah, I really do like how we happen to end on two stories that are relevant to the evolutionary origins of chickens. So one from their very recent past and another from their somewhat more distant past. But yeah, all leading up to this wonderful animal.
Right. I honestly, I only like figured that out until you had done your
Okay.
extraterrestrial.
Yeah, that
Oh,
was that was not planned on my part either. Yeah, so yeah, that was funny. But yeah, I think with that, we've gotten to the end of our roundup, I believe.
yeah. So as y'all can see, I mean, this is just a handful of some of the really cool
Mhm.
stuff that was discovered last year,
Yep.
and oh gosh, I mean, 2021, that's going to be big, I'm sure.
Yeah. Looking forward to seeing what happens. In fact, we already have a few stories from this year coming right up, right? Um,
That's right. I think
yeah.
we have one of yours as per our usual format.
Right.
Albert or I does a story, and then we swap, and it's about two for each of us.
Right. Right. Yep. So we're gonna move on to kind of our main news section, I suppose, or more typical news section. Um, so we'll cover four more stories that were recently came out in the past couple months, and that'll be our show.
All right.
Right. So, my first story that I picked came out in December 2020, and so this story made a pretty big splash in the paleo community because it's a pretty big deal. So this study was on a group of Triassic reptiles called Lagopetids, and Lagopetids are a group of small reptiles, like smaller than a cat. Um, and they're kind of long and slender and these very long limbs. And traditionally, it has been thought that Lagopetids were especially closely related to dinosaurs. So they were kind of the model of what like the ancestral dinosaur was like before it was like a true dinosaur, basically. And so they were considered to be dinosauromorphs. So part of the group that includes dinosaurs and their closest relatives. Um, and that was the conventional thinking for quite a long time. But last year, this new study came out, and they described. They looked at existing known specimens of Lagopetids, but they also described some new Lagopetid specimens as well. And they also used like CT scanning to take a look at how the brain structure of Lagopetids looked like, looking at these little details of anatomy that are hard to observe from just physically examining the specimens. And they found that it turns out Lagopetids have a lot of intriguing similarities to early pterosaurs. Now, as you probably know if you're listening or watching this show, pterosaurs were not dinosaurs, but it is thought that pterosaurs were probably close relatives of dinosaurs, both belonging to a group called Ornithidaira. However, the origins of pterosaurs are very mysterious. We don't know much about what the very ancestral pterosaurs look like. We don't have an Archaeopteryx of pterosaurs, it is often said. We don't know what pterosaur relatives were like before they became pterosaurs. Like, what were the non-flying ancestors that directly led up to pterosaurs look like? We did not know. However, it turns out that with this study and with these new features that they found in lagopetids, they ran a phylogenetic analysis taking into account their observations, and they found that instead of being more closely related to dinosaurs, lagopetids were instead more closely related to pterosaurs, so they are instead pterosauromorphs and not dinosauromorphs. And so, it turns out that apparently we did have these kind of early pterosaur relatives all along. And in hindsight, they do seem to have a lot of similarities. On the next slide, I believe I show a figure from the paper showing this. So I think in each of these comparisons, the pterosaur is the one on the right, I believe, and the lagopetid is the one on the left. I think I got that right. And so they compare several different features of the anatomy here. Like in the top left, you can see the brain structure. In early pterosaurs and lagopetids, it's actually pretty similar. The feature of the snout, of the teeth, of the limbs. There are similarities all over the skeleton. And so it does seem like with this new study, lagopetids as pterosauromorphs, of course, further confirmation would be nice, but I think they made a pretty strong case for it. And if this is the case, it turns out that we probably can say a few we can potentially make a few inferences about early pterosaur evolution. And for example, they mentioned that since the brain structure of lagopetids and pterosaurs were pretty similar, probably a lot of the features of the brain that helped pterosaurs fly were already present in the non-flying lagopetids, so it was exapted later for flight, which is, of course, a very similar story. We see that in the origin of birds, where a lot of features we think of as being bird-like and associated with flight originated in very different kind of contexts within non-bird dinosaurs. And so, it seems like pterosaurs might have evolved from these very small, probably pretty agile, slender, or reptiles that were non-flying, but would eventually give rise to this very spectacular kind of radiation of flying clades, flying species. So that is absolutely fascinating. Fills in a major gap in our evolution or knowledge of evolution of reptiles, and is just overall a really cool study, I think. Do you have any further thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'm definitely happy to see this sort of part of the reptile family tree filled in a little bit. I look at lagopetids and I'm reminded of Mark Whitten's pterosaur book,
Oh yeah,
where he kind of he made some like proto-pterosaurs.
right,
I don't have the book with me right now, but I remember them distinctly. Like they look like lagopetids with like hints of wings
right,
and things like that. So like it's kind of cool to see like that sort of bridge being kind of filled in a little bit.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it has a lot of interesting implications. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, a lagopetid, just looking at the layout of the body, it looks like it was kind of a upright, sort of bipedalish
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
animal. So like that would kind of imply that like early pterosaurs evolved from bipedal animals.
Could be. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, of course, there's always uncertainties there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the bipedality is an artifact, and maybe like because like you look at a frog skeleton,
Right. Right.
like that, you can make them look like bipedal animals, but they're clearly not.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Uh, Indeed. I think there is some uncertainty about like what the locomotion of lagopedids was like. Like people have made speculated about it, of course, but there aren't a lot of detailed studies that have been done. I know there are some research projects ongoing that will most likely look into them. Like there's there's a big one called the Dawn Dinosaurs Project, which is meant to look at the locomotion of a lot of different Triassic reptiles, and I would imagine they probably intend to look at lagopedids. So it would be fascinating to find out exactly what they were doing. So yeah, the word lagarpetid, which is derived from the specific genus Lagerpeton, um, means rabbit kind of crawling thing or rabbit reptile, I guess. Um,
Oh,
yeah, so it was probably named that because people thought with those very long hind limbs, it might have been kind of hopping like a rabbit, which is a possibility. Um, so yeah, it definitely would be interesting to see more detailed studies on this. And since we now consider Lagopetids to likely be relevant to pterosaur origins, I imagine we'll be seeing more studies on them, in the not too distant future.
yeah, I can hope so. Yeah, I guess I should add too. Like we need that Archaeopteryx for bats too.
Right, yes. Yeah, that's the big gap that we're still missing for the flying tetrapods. So yeah, hopefully someday we find a good Paleocene deposit and find something good there.
Absolutely, yeah. But no, this is incredible, and I'm happy to see this study out.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think we're going to start to see a huge chunk of research come quickly underway as
Hmm.
far as like fleshing out this group of animals and finally figuring out once and for all, what does an early pterosaur look like?
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, before I move on, I wanted to say that I'm glad you mentioned Mark Whitten's pterosaurs because that didn't occur to me. Yeah, he basically had a chapter on pterosaur origins in there, and he had these hypothetical pterosaur ancestors. And you're right; a lot of them did resemble Lagarpetids quite a bit, like, to an extent that I think they're partially based on another Triassic reptile called a Scleromochlus, which has
Mm.
also been considered. Likely relevant to pterosaur origins, although that is controversial. And it also has a somewhat similar body plan with a very slender body and long limbs. And so, yeah, I guess it really isn't a big leap, so to speak, that Lagarpetids would also turn out to be part of the tree. All right, I think that's all I have to say about that one. So you may proceed.
Sure, absolutely. Um, Funny thing happened when picking the January stories for this
Mm.
episode. They both featured dogs.
Right.
That was kind of a nice surprise. Um, for the record, I've never seen Game of Thrones. Um, I don't plan to.
Right.
Um, I know the show has dire wolves. They look really cool. That's super awesome.
Mm.
So I don't know if this needs mentioning considering who most of our audience is, but yeah, dire wolves were real.
Yep.
Um, they used to range across North and South America and into Asia too, which I didn't know.
Mm.
During the Pleistocene epoch. Um, they were fairly common predators. They likely lived in packs and went after large prey animals of the day, bison, camels, horses, and even mastodons.
Mm.
Quite a number of them got trapped in the famous tar pits of Rancho La Brea in California, which is why we know so much about them. There's
Right.
like hundreds and hundreds of skulls and other parts of these wolves that have been found. Um, but one mystery, however, has been their location on the family tree of the Canidae, the dog family. We call them dire wolves.
Right.
They looked a lot like wolves in their skeleton, except for their size.
Mm.
They were much heavier. We even put them in the same genus as the wolf, as Canis diurus.
Right. Mm.
Um, but just how closely related were they to the wolves that live today? Well, that's just what this paper from last month set out to do. For the first time, we have genomes from 5 direwolves that were sequenced and compared with those of many other canid species, including the gray wolf, but also coyotes, jackals, African wild dogs, and a few foxes as outgroups. Now, you'd think they group pretty closely with modern dogs of the genus Canis, right?
Mm.
Well, it turns out they're not even close.
Mm.
As you can see in the phylogenetic tree to the right, the direwolf, and that's the branch in red, um, actually branched off very distantly from true wolves and their kin
Mm.
about 5.7 million years ago. That means that the very similar appearance and overall anatomy to living wolves is a matter of convergence, especially when you consider that some of the dogs more closely related to wolves, like the African wild dog, look
Yeah.
quite distinct.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an incredible case of convergence there. Although, despite the look on Game of Thrones, living direwolves, probably looked about as different from wolves as African wild dogs do.
Yeah.
Consider like their fur, their coat patterns. And indeed, the accompanying illustration, which I couldn't include in here, um, from master paleo artist Mauricio Anton, who's
Mhm.
well known for his paleomammalogy artworks, he kind of plays with that suggestion and makes them look very distinct from wolves, like they're fighting over a carcass.
Right.
And like you can clearly tell one is a wolf and one is a dire wolf. Um, uh, like in this case, then in real life, that it probably would be very easy to tell them apart just by looking at them. Think about how lions and tigers look so different from each other, despite their skeletons looking fairly close to each other.
Right.
So a bit of an all yesterday situation going on here,
Hmm.
where the skeletons may look very close, but the two animals were like, who knows how completely different they were when you slap on fur and color and
Right.
stuff.
Right.
Um, Now, having split off on their own 5.7 million years ago or so, the direwolf lineage must then have inhabited the Americas by themselves for quite a long time before true wolves and coyotes showed up. Indeed, there has been previous fossil and genetic evidence that shows that these dogs only entered the Americas relatively recently in time. The common ancestor of those species would have lived in Eurasia, while the direwolf had free reign of North and South America. Um, in fact, it was only about 2.5 million years ago that the genus Canis evolved at all,
Mm.
and they crossed Beringia only about 100,000 years ago, and then entered a continent that was already inhabited by a successful predatory dog, if you will.
Mm.
So then, well, what does that mean concerning their taxonomy? Should we call the direwolf Canis dirus?
Mhm.
Canid nomenclature has been going through a bit of change recently, most notably the increasing suggestion to split up several of the former members of Canis and give them their own genera. So in this case, we have a bit of the splitters having reign here. Um, and so this then would leave the five species of wolf. So the gray, the eastern, the red, the Ethiopian, and the African golden, along with the coyote and the Eurasian jackal as the constituents of Canis. So as you move further back in time through the dog family tree, um, we meet dogs that have their own distinct lineages then. So you have the dhole, who is a kuan, the African wild dong, which is a lycaon. You have the black-backed and the side-striped jackals, Lupu lila. And finally, we come to the dire wolf. And now that we recognize that it's very distinct in terms of the other dogs in the family tree, the authors argue that we should probably give them a different genus too. And they actually suggest Anoscion,
Mm.
which turns out was actually proposed as far back as 1918.
Mm. Mm.
They argue to kind of bring this back from taxonomic hell and get
Right.
it in place in modern nomenclature. Um, so that name, that genus, means terrible wolf. So now when you include the species name Diarus, you get the fearful, terrible wolf.
Wow.
Now, if that doesn't strike fear into the hearts of your enemies, I don't know what will. Dogs communicated through Latin and Greek.
Right. Right.
Now, I guess on one last note, we can still call them dire wolves.
Right.
Naming things despite their biology has been around for a long time. And like the most common response that people have given is that, well, we have the maned wolf, which
Right.
belongs to its own distinct lineage of South American dogs that is distantly related to true wolves.
Mm.
We're happy to keep that name. So I don't see why we need to like abandon the name dire wolf. I think
Mm.
keeping that would be just fine, as a lot of folks would tend to agree to.
Right. Right.
So that's all I have to say on that. It's kind of really cool when we get like a radical new understanding of such a relatively
Yeah.
recently extinct animal. I mean, I think direwolves somehow snuck into the Holocene for a bit before they died
Wow.
out.
Huh.
So they're
That's.
certainly very familiar with the Native American groups living on the
Mm. Wow. Huh. That's really cool. Yeah. But and so is the study. It's really great to see the study out because I actually saw a presentation on it um, back in SVP 2019, I think. So that was the one in Australia. So this is a Society of Vertebrate Paleontology annual conference, and so one of the presentations at that conference was this specific study before it was published. And so yeah, it was definitely one of the highlights of the talks that I saw, because yeah, this is really cool, like figuring out the phylogenetic position of the dire wolf, and then finding out that it is not that closely related to a gray wolf at all. Really, yeah, unexpected. So I was kind of waiting and waiting for the study to come out, and now it did. So it's
I think it kind of goes to show that, I mean, when we consider the history of North American wildlife,
right.
um, it's different from what a lot of folks would probably think about.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of our iconic, megafauna or iconic animals, if you will. The moose, the brown bear, um, the elk, the bison, um, the bald eagle, and the gray wolf, and all these guys. They are not long-lived species in North America. A lot
Right.
of them probably came alongside, Homo sapiens when
Yeah.
they started settling in the continents, anywhere from 30 to 15,000 years ago or so, through Beringia,
Right.
meaning that prior to their arrival, North America kind of had to have its own, had to have those niches filled by other unique animals,
Right.
stag moose and unique kinds of bison, and in this case, dire wolves.
Right.
So with the megafaunal extinctions, a lot of those animals were lost, and then their kind of place in the ecology was taken over by these recent arrivals.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of made up, what we typically think of as our stereotypical North American wildlife that graces dinner plates and posters and Americana today. You think of America. What do you think of? You think of the bald eagle or the bison,
Right.
wolf. It's iconic,
Right.
and that seems to be a case in a lot of areas around the world too. Like I remember reading Prothero's book, After the Dinosaurs, which is a favorite of mine, and how like the history of like African wildlife went through these huge like faunal transitions where like a lot of the iconic African wildlife that we know about, zebras and rhinos and giraffes and lions and jackals and things, like their recent arrivals too.
Right.
And
Right.
their place in the environment was previously occupied by other more unique animals. The Afro-Perians, for example, had
Right.
into the place. So yeah, like like looking at the study in that context, I think is really fascinating.
For sure. Yeah, I agree. And like if you've grown up in North America, it's often hard to appreciate, but the North American biogeography is really fascinating. Like the constituents of the ecosystem, and what animals are where, and where different groups originate, how they got into the continent. It's all very, very interesting. Of course, biogeography is always interesting, whichever the continent. But I think it's easy to lose sight of how exceptional, like your own kind of home territory is, if you spent there for a while without really thinking about it.
Right.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you there. Okay, do we want to do the next story?
Absolutely.
Cool. All right, so the next story I picked is about a living animal, about a fish, in fact. So this is about electric eels. Now, I guess a little bit of a background about electric eels. So they're found in South America, and they are not eels. Um, they actually belong to a group called the Neotropical knife fish. And most members of this group, you can easily tell why they're called knife fish, because their body is kind of shaped like a knife. It's very laterally flattened, but kind of has a blade-like shape. And part of the reason for this is that most of their fins are not very well developed, except for they have a very, very long anal fin that extends down the bottom of their body. And so something very interesting about these knife fish is that most of them can produce electricity. Now, pretty much all animals produce electricity with the muscular movements and all that, but they're like tiny uh, the bits of electricity that don't really register to anyone, but unless you're like really electrosensitive, which some animals are. But the knifefish, they can actually produce electricity that they can use for doing things. Now, most of them do not use their electricity to attack other animals. Um, what they do is that they tend to use their electricity for navigation, because the waters of, like, for example, the Amazon that they live in um, tend to be very murky. It's really hard to see down there. So instead, they'll kind of generate this little electrical field around themselves, and if they run into anything that gets in the way of that field, they can detect it and get out of the way as necessary. It is also possible that they use these electric signals to communicate with one another. So different species of these electric fish seem to use different frequencies of electric signals, and using this, they can identify, whether or not a certain other fish coming their way is there's the same species as them or not, and so on. And now the electric eel, or rather I should say electric eels now for reasons I'll get to soon. Electric eels are very large species of knifefish that have kind of weaponized their electric generating abilities. So they'll actually use their electricity to hunt and kill their prey. So they'll generate electricity to stun animals that they want to eat, and they'll also use it for self-defense as well. If they're grabbed by a predator, they can deliver a very nasty electric shock. And they are some of the most powerful in terms of their electricity generation of any kind of electric fish known. They In theory, electric eel can generate enough electricity to kill a human. There haven't been many documented cases of this actually happening, but it is possible. And definitely, even if it doesn't kill you, it can give you a very painful shock for sure. And recently, for a long time, electric eels were assumed to be just one species, but a recent genetic study, I think it came out like a couple years ago, something like that, or maybe two, or maybe just last year. They found that there was evidence that three different populations of electric eels were distinct enough to be considered three different species, and so now they have been, or at least proposed, it has been proposed that they should be split into these three. And the particular species that the study I'm going to talk about today focus on is called the Volta's electric eel, named after a person who gave us the volt unit, or rather the person who's the volt unit was named after.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He is widely credited as the creator of the electric battery, I believe. So that's where it comes from. And the Volta's electric eel has the highest, or the strongest recorded electricity produced by all the three species of electric eel. So yeah, it has that claim to fame for it. Now, it has been widely assumed that electric eels are mostly solitary hunters, that they don't really have much to do with each other most of the time. They just kind of hunt alone and do their thing. But this study that came out in January found evidence that they actually sometimes hunt in groups, which is a behavior that, as far as I know, hasn't really been documented before. And so this study, basically they recorded these observations of Volta's electric eels hunting in groups on 6 different occasions. I think between 2012 and 2014 were when the observations were actually made. So they were observing these electric eels in a river in Brazil. And so they found these very interesting behaviors. So first of all, these electric eels, they spent most of the day resting at the bottom of the river. They just lie still at the bottom of the river, not doing much, which is kind of behavior that a lot of knifefish do for most of the day. But during dusk and dawn, suddenly they would become active, and they would start kind of interacting with each other. They would kind of mingle with each other for 20 to 30 minutes. And then eventually, in a group, or at least in loose groups, they would swim towards a part of the river where the water was very shallow. And in the shallow region, there were these logs and things, and probably other bits of vegetation that smaller fish would would hide in. And then this big group of electric eels, of over 100, they report in the paper, they would kind of spook these smaller fish and then herd them into a tight ball to make forming a tight ball. And you've probably seen this in if you watch a lot of nature documentaries about the ocean, where a group of small fish gets herded into a tight ball by predators. And so that's kind of what these electric eels were doing. Um, Electric eels, they would swim in circles to kind of fence the smaller fish in, and then a subset of the electric eels, like I think like up to around 10 individuals at a time, would lunge into the shoal of fish and deliver electric shocks, shocking the fish, and the stunned fish would kind of float to the surface, and then the electric eels would like, grab the immobilized prey items. And then they would do this several times. According to the paper, each time a different set of electric eels would duly attack, and then they would eventually they kind of dispersed after, presumably after they had their fill, um, until the next hunt, presumably when the next dusk or dawn. So yeah, that's a very fascinating behavior that had not been recorded before in this species. On the next slide, I show a figure from the paper which shows basically the activity patterns of these electric eels. And so, if you look at it for a little bit, you can see this is basically what the daily activity patterns were like. They observed these, after they realized that these electric eels were doing this, they observed them over a period of, I think, 3 days or so. And so they were able to get the electric eels schedule down pretty well. And you can see here, on the top of the figure, they're showing basically what the electric eels were doing at different times of day. And for most of the day, they're just resting at the bottom of the river. But during dusk and dawn, they would start becoming active. They would have a period of interaction before they all set out and swam into the shallow region of the river. And then they would have a period of about an hour for hunting, the hunting behavior that I just described earlier. And they would go back and take a rest. And they have these schematic figures showing what the electric eels were doing during each of these phases, I guess. So yeah, super interesting, and I think pretty unexpected, I would say.
Yeah, this is so freaking cool. Like, my goodness, have we underestimated fish?
Right.
You know, I swear it's like I'm my attention is drawn to like a study or an observation, and it's like there's clearly more to these animals than I think a lot of people give credit for.
Yeah, for sure.
The trope of the dumb goldfish has a lot of harm, I think.
Yeah, indeed. There's a great book called What a Fish Knows, which is about kind of the recent, I guess you could say, revolution in understanding, how fish behave and their cognitive abilities and interesting skills that they have. Because it turns out, fish are not as dumb as we like to think. They have some pretty complex behaviors, and we're only really just now starting to understand or even record some of them for the first time, as we can see potentially in this instance too.
Yeah. That's definitely a wish list book to read at some point. Yeah, I love that because like I have a book that I've read, What a Plant Knows,
Ah,
which
yeah.
it basically does the same thing, and really kind of brings to light like plants actually are active dynamic organisms. They're alive, so clearly they have um, they have adaptations and needs and they've been able to survive for so long by not being just static things that grow in the ground.
Right.
So yeah, I totally feel you there. Um, yeah, this is an incredible study. I'm glad you were able to highlight this for us.
Yeah, I'm glad to highlight it for you because I definitely thought it was very interesting. Um, but yeah, I think that about covers it. Do you want to do your next story, which will be our final story of the episode?
Sure, sounds good. Yeah, this was another one that I obsessed over as I was reading up on it. It's really cool. Um, so, and yeah, again, it has to do with doggos. So we're gonna we're gonna shift the story from the dire wolf lineage to the true wolf lineage,
Hmm.
and then we come to the conundrum that is the domestication of the dog,
You're right.
which seems to have been the very first animal that underwent this process by human beings. Now, I mean, we changed its appearance and temperament into something very different from a wild wolf. Even at a passing glance through a pet shelter, you can see that the dogs we have today are not like the wolves that we see in the wild or on nature documentaries. Um, Now, I say conundrum because, yeah, while we know that, I think we're pretty confident that the gray wolf is the ancestral species to the domestic dog. Um, People even go as far as to say that the dog should be Canis lupus familiaris
Right,
to
right.
kind of hone that in. Um, but it is still an open question, not only how dogs became domesticated, but where and when. And so this paper from last month attempts to answer the latter two questions. And thankfully, we're in an even greater position to do so because we have quite a number of remains of early domestic dogs going back many thousands of years and across the world. Um, a few studies in the past have attempted to do this with a range of results, arguing for dog domestication as early as 40,000 years ago to as late as 20,000 years ago. Um, these studies have placed the first dogs across various regions of Eurasia. Um, Different papers have suggested Europe or present day China or Central Asia. And they even argued at various times that, you know, there may have been one domestication event or there may have been two, in which the other dogs from maybe one of the origins were mostly subsumed into the other populations,
Right.
so that they've been heavily reduced today to a couple of aberrant breeds. So, what seems the most likely out of all of these different scenarios? Well, for this most recent study, the authors decided to get some help by incorporating data from early human populations. They noticed in various literature that movement of dogs into certain regions of the world almost always correlated with the movements of people. And this does seem fairly obvious enough in certain cases. When you have the Austronesian speaking groups that began moving into the South Pacific about 5,000 years ago and onwards, they brought dogs with them. When people started settling in the high North American Arctic for the first time, they also brought dogs with them, twice actually. Um, there are earlier movements about 5,000 years ago that established the now extinct Dorset culture. Um, and then there were later ones about 1,000 years ago, so simultaneous with the Norse colonies in Greenland and Vinland, that contributed to the founding of the modern Aleut and Inuit cultures. And both of them had their own distinct breeds of dogs that they brought with them. So it stands to reason this correlated movement of people with their dogs was probably going on even earlier than these Holocene movements to the Pleistocene, when dogs were first domesticated. For example, regarding the human settlement of the Americas, we know that many Amerindian nations had dogs of their own. There's a rich literature on that. And the genetic work done on these particular breeds has revealed a lot of really fascinating history, most notably the realization that these breeds formed their own distinct American lineage that was sadly wiped out for the most part following European colonization. Um, that these dogs formed their own clade means that they likely entered the Americas alongside the first humans to do so by 15,000 years ago, according to the genetic evidence. Of course, that's not to ignore the mounting evidence of an even earlier human presence on these continents, but hey, look, now's the time to get into that. So, what did the authors find when they compared the timing of ancient human DNA splits with those of ancient dogs? Well, as you can see here in this time chart for the phylogeny of ancient dogs, you have the oldest split occurring around 22,000 years ago, and a later one occurring around 16,000 years ago. Now, both of these events occurred in Northeast Asia, in present day Eastern Russia. Then we come to a four-way radiation of dog lineages in the Americas around 15,000 years ago. So now, when we compare that to the human DNA model on the next slide, what do you know? It's a fairly close match.
Wow.
According to the ancient DNA evidence at present, and again, it must be reminded that these lineages would not have been like wholly isolated populations, and they were almost certainly sharing genes with each other. Um, Trying to make a phylogeny of humans leaves a lot of details out.
Right, right.
So I have to put that asterisk there. Yeah, what we find first for humans in Northeast Asia around 24,000 years ago is a splitting off of the ancestors of a group called the ancient Paleo-Siberians. Now, the term Paleo-Siberian is a bit of a catch-all linguistic term for a number of probably unrelated
Hmm.
but widely different language families that can be found in this general region of the world. So, for example, you have the uh, Yeniseian languages, which are all extinct except for one called Ket, which is spoken by the people called the Ket, who live in central Russia along the Yenisei River, hence the name. There's also a family called Chukutko-Kamchatkan, which is present throughout northeast Russia and is spoken by a number of indigenous groups like the Chukchi. So subsequent linguistic and genetic and archaeological evidence actually points strongly to these peoples sharing distant connections with the ancestors of those who first settled in the North American Arctic. So I mentioned the Dorset and the Inuit earlier. Of course, it's a story for another day. So moving on, we see another split occurring about 21,000 years ago. And this time it's associated with the peopling of Beringia, which is that great landmass when the sea levels were low that connected Asia with North America.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and there would have been a period called the Beringian standstill, where groups of humans kind of just hung around long enough for particular genes to emerge in their populations that are now only distinct in certain groups in the Americas. Of course, these would eventually be carried along by the ancestors of those peoples who would become established in the Americas soon afterwards, while other folks seem to have just kind of stayed put on this now vanished landmass. And those are known as the ancestral or the ancient Beringians. Now, eventually, after people began making their way into North and South America, either by boat or by land or both, there appeared in the genetic evidence a major split occurring around 15,000 years ago. Ancient DNA researchers have coined these lineages, perhaps a little bit confusingly, the Northern North American and the Southern North American, because it seems that the former mostly hung around in the most northerly regions of the continent, so parts of present-day Canada, while the latter group not only peopled more of the continent to the south, but also headed further south into Central and South America. Now, the details of these particular movements is again, it's full of details and discourse, and they're probably way oversimplified.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
if anything, this gives us at least a model to work with. So, having said that, if we go to the next slide,
Yep.
where the two charts on the left are
Hmm.
put together, yeah, you can definitely see the correlation here. It's not 100% identical, but the comparisons are very, very strong.
Hmm. Hmm.
Given what we know about the history of dogs in the Americas, the authors argue that humans indeed, did bring dogs with them when they began to settle in the Western Hemisphere. And now that that was settled for the time being, then the question went back to dog domestication itself. If ancient Paleo-Siberians had dogs hanging out with them, and ancient Beringians and Amerindians had dogs hanging out with them, well, then the date for the domestication of dogs had to have been by the ancestors of these peoples before 24 to 22,000 years ago. And seeing as these places didn't have dogs beforehand, it probably occurred somewhere towards the west. And the authors make a strong case for this occurring somewhere in Greater Siberia. Now, if you happen to notice in the human lineage tree, and it's at the bottom here, there's these green checkered arrows that are heading towards the leftmost branches where the Paleo-Siberian and Beringian groups diverge.
Hmm.
Well, those arrows represent gene flow from a group called the Ancient North Siberians, who I haven't mentioned yet. They're usually referred to in the literature as Ancient North Eurasians to kind of make the point home that this is a large landmass we're talking about here, incorporating Europe into the story. And this group, as a distinct people and culture, don't exist in their original state anymore. We've known about them for many years before we even understood this DNA evidence. They're represented in the archaeological record as the Malta Bure and Afontova Gora cultures, which inhabited west of Lake Baikal in Siberia between about 26,000 and 12,000 years ago. Although the DNA evidence suggests that the ancient North Eurasians were around even earlier than that. We just haven't found remains for them yet. They were taiga-adapted peoples. They made flake stone tools, and they attached these to bone and antler spears because wood was not easily found in this part of the world. And they hunted mammoths and other big game. They made jewelry out of ivory, and they built these semi-subterranean homes out of reindeer bones and skin. And the authors speculate that it was these particular people, these ancient North Siberians, who may have been the ones to have domesticated the dog. There are remains of canines that have been found, in particular with the Fontova sites, and they greatly resemble domestic dogs of an early variety that we find in, say, remains in the Americas, for example. Um, so, by examining some of the better known phylogeny of dogs, like, for example, there's an example of one on the right here, the authors did find that the earliest known split might have occurred, get this, between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago.
Hmm.
That's well within the time frame that the ancient North Eurasians were present. Now, why is that significant? Well, remember how I said that these people aren't around in their original state anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's because, according to the genetic data, groups of ancient North Siberians over time had begun to expand their ranges westward and eastward across the continent. And they gradually intermixed with local groups as they moved. Now, in the case of the West, we find these ancient North Eurasian genes in groups of people living on the Pontic steppe around 5,000 years ago. And in the archaeological literature, these are known as the Yamnaya cultures. And these are the ones who eventually introduced the Indo-European languages into Europe, Southwest Asia, and India. And so to the east, the ancestral North Eurasians contributed their DNA to the ancestors of the Paleo-Siberians, Beringians, and Amerindians that I discussed previously. So, by taking all this into account, now we have a model that really beautifully explains how domestic dogs managed to spread across Eurasia because they moved along with these expanding populations of ancient North Eurasians. And again, looking at the phylogenetic tree to the right, it fits very well with the previous dog DNA evidence that we have. That basal split of dogs between 26 and 19,000 years ago. Well, that's between the dogs of eastern Siberia, the high Arctic, and the Americas, and the dogs of western Siberia and Europe, as well as Africa and eastern Asia.
Right.
And of course, it's going to take a hell of a lot more studies than just this to see if this hypothesis checks out. But at the moment, it really paints a neat picture of the early relationship between dogs and humans.
Yeah, for sure.
It makes a lot of sense to me personally. I mean, you have a pet dog, and wherever you go, you want that dog to go with you. So it stands to reason that people are going to be taking their dogs with them wherever they go.
Right.
It's like, Pleistocene Eurasia. They want that company there. They want that resource. So I thought that was really, really cool. Yeah, I mean, the history of dogs, I could easily do a whole episode about it.
I'm sure, yeah.
Because there's a lot of really interesting genetic things that were going on, like those North American dogs and Arctic dogs. That particular lineage also seems to have included dogs in the Pacific Islands and Australia. So the dingo and the new singing dog, for example, belong to that lineage. And when the Western dog started encroaching further and further into Eastern Asia, they actually started replacing a lot of those breeds there. So now a lot of that particular branch was heavily reduced into historical times. In fact, I know Castello's book, Canids of the World, takes this and uses it for his taxonomy of dogs.
Oh, yeah.
He takes the domestic dog and splits it into two main groups to correspond with this phylogeny. So you have the Western dogs, right, which is all the ones from Europe and Africa and East Asia that are today remain the dominant type of dog in the world. And what he calls pariah dogs are the ones that colonize the Americas with people and the Arctic and also in the Pacific region, for example. And there are not a lot of them around today because of this population turnover with the Western dogs. So they're very fascinating and important if you want to understand early dog history.
Right.
So yeah, oh my gosh, I could talk about this all day, but yeah, I definitely wanted to highlight this study as one of my favorite studies from January.
Yeah, I can see why. It's definitely very striking how well that those evolutionary histories line up. And yeah, I agree. It makes quite a bit of sense.
Yeah,
All right. Um, I think that is all of our stories for this episode. Is that right?
I believe so. We go to the next slide.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a doozy of an episode. I'm very happy.
Yeah, me too. So, yeah, as usual, we want to thank our friends Henry and Alicia for their contributions to our episodes. And if you want to, follow along and see whenever we release a new episode, you can follow us on Twitter as well as on our YouTube channel directly. If you have questions for us, you can send us an email or leave a comment. And we will include links to references for this episode, as always. Um, so, yeah, have a really good one. Next episode, I think we're due to come back to my Dinosaurs the Second Chapter series. So the next episode I had lined up for that is the shorebirds, which I think you'll be looking forward to. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, we'll look at plovers and sandpipers and gulls and a lot of other groups. They're a very diverse group with many different ecologies. So it'll be pretty. It'll be an interesting challenge to cover them all. I'll have to say. Um, so we'll be looking forward to that. And
And I think after that, then would be my
that's
series,
right.
and we'll talk about Neanderthals and Denisovans.
Sweet.
So yeah, we got a lot of great stuff to look forward to. And then, hey, y'all, happy 2021. We look forward to a whole year of excitement and fantastic natural history news that we'll share with you all. And we appreciate you all coming and supporting us
Mhm.
all this time.
Yeah, definitely. So stay safe and take care, everybody.
See y'all.